Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Welcome back to another episode of the Work From Home Show. I'm your co-host, Naresh, with my main man, my co-host, my brother from another mother, my former boss, my business partner,
Adam. Up in the house. Yep.
There we go.
I'm here. I'm awake. I'm ready to go.
I'm awake. We're recording pretty late. That's what we usually record.
This is early for us. Are you kidding me? It's only 9:30 here.
10:30 on the East Coast. And this is how we do our recordings, folks, because we have to work from home during the day or be stay-at-home dads or stay-at-home husbands during the day.
Yeah, and especially nowadays.
Especially nowadays. So, Adam, I think the next couple of episodes, what we'll do is we'll share ways that people can start their own business from home, ways they can make passive income from home without leaving the house. So expect that, homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, everybody out there. I think these are probably going to be some of the most valuable episodes of our entire first season, because we're going to share with you exactly how you can do it yourself, how you can start your business, how you can podcast, how you can write a book, how you can buy real estate from home without even leaving your house. How does that sound, Adam?
That sounds like leaving the house is for suckers and chumps.
Yeah, it absolutely is. That's what I think of people who have to leave their house to go to work every day. So this episode, let's focus on, what do you think, Adam? What do you say we focus on podcasting? Because
nobody likes podcasts.
Yeah, our 18 listeners do. Our 18
true.
Listeners do.
Can't argue with 18.
So we started this podcast, and we brought up earlier how we started it within like one business day, maybe. So I want to go over just kind of the process of how we did it, the equipment that you need, why you should maybe podcast, what's a good podcast undertaking versus what's not a good podcast undertaking. And Adam and I together, between the back end stuff like the audio editing, technology, website design, and the front end stuff like the production, like more the direction of the show, the guests who are brought on, like editorial stuff. I think we're going to cover a lot of ground here so that you yourself will feel comfortable by the end of this episode to start your own podcast if that's what you want to do.
Yep.
So first, I want to start by saying it's impossible for us to cover every single detail on this episode. It's just absolutely impossible. So I want to offer to our listeners, go to our website, www.workfromhomeshow.com, get on our mailing list. After you get on our mailing list, leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Find us there, hit the subscribe button, leave us a review.
Or, if you don't use iTunes and Apple Podcasts anywhere, from somebody who doesn't own an iPhone, that's me.
Okay, that's a good point. So it could be Spotify, it could be Player.fm, it could be TuneIn, Stitcher, you name it. Whatever podcast platform you're using. I use Apple Podcasts / iTunes. Whatever you're using, go on there, rate us, review us, take a screenshot of that review, and email us, hello@workfromhomeshow.com, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. Email it to us, and I will send you a free copy of my first book, my number one best-selling book, my most sold book, Podcastnomics, the book of podcasting to make you millions. I'll give it to you for free. Absolutely for free. And it'll be the audiobook version. And if I really am in a good mood, I might send you the Kindle version as well.
That just depends on how much his kid's crying that day.
Yes, it does. Exactly. And I'll tell you, he cried a lot today. He got his vaccinations, his first vaccinations, and whoa, I did not expect that. It only lasted about a minute, though, so it wasn't.
I trusted you, Dad.
So Adam, podcasting. Our listeners are listening to this podcast. I think the first important thing that people who are thinking about starting a podcast, first most important thing is there a market for your podcast? And so what I mean by...
Well, I disagree a little bit. I would say the very first thing you need to do is decide if you're doing this as a hobby or as a business.
And why do you say that?
Because if it's a hobby, then who cares if there's a market for it?
Okay, now I'm understanding. Okay, so you're right. You actually, good correction, because I kind of just assumed that people, I would say there are three different categories. Is it a hobby, is it a business, or is it somewhere in between where it's like, hey, there's an opportunity here, but I'm not really sure if this is like $1 million idea, but who cares because there is a huge opportunity and let's just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, that's fair.
So I don't even know what to call that, but but anyway, so I think we got the whole hobby thing out of the way. If you just want to do it as a hobby, this is still a very valuable episode for you, and I think you'll learn a lot. But if you want to do the latter two that we just said, the business or just finding the opportunity and running with it, the first important thing is there a market? And what I mean by is there a market is there a niche market? Can you get very granular with that market? So for example, if you are somebody who likes sports, so you say, I want to start a sports podcast. And if you were to email us, hello@workfromhomeshow.com, you say, hey, I want to start a sports podcast. What do you guys think? I will probably email you back and say, best of luck. You're not going to do very well.
Yeah. That's the nicest way you could respond to that.
Yeah. Because sports, like what sports are we? Sports is very broad. Sports can be like you play rugby, Adam.
Yep.
So it could be rugby. It could be the NHL, the NBA. It could be professional sports. It could be college sports, high school sports. It could be sports overseas, like cricket in India. It's very broad. And so you're now competing with the worldwide leader in sports, which is ESPN.
Yeah, and you're competing against like professional athletes, retired professional athletes, and all the people who have big names coming in. You don't want to be doing that.
You don't want to be doing that. It's way too broad. It's too broad. And look, I like sports, but if I have to listen to a broad sports podcast, but I'm only interested in, let's say, the NFL, the NBA, college basketball, and World Cup cricket, but I've got to listen to all this crap about college volleyball and high school soccer, I'm tuning out because I don't care. And me personally, I'd probably stop subscribing to that podcast because there's just too much irrelevant information to my liking. So you need to get very granular. So you can actually still start a sports podcast, but instead of it being a general sports podcast, now if you started a podcast about the Golden State Warriors basketball team, now we've gotten from broad sports to basketball to professional basketball to NBA basketball to the Golden State Warriors. Or even more niche would be starting a podcast about Michael Jordan. Just Michael Jordan. That's it. And all you talk about is Michael Jordan and how great a player he is and how you love his shoes and how you bought his cologne and it smells good, and you interview Michael Jordan on your show and you talk about Space Jam and Space Jam 2, and that's now all of a sudden you've got a very niche topic so that the people listening, they're not people who are listening to you because they want to hear about cricket or they want to hear about basketball. They want to hear about Michael Jordan. Mm-hmm. And so, Adam, you actually gave me a good example of a niche topic that a friend of yours, he launched a podcast. What was, and it's doing very well.
Are you talking about the Star Wars one?
Yeah, the Star Wars one.
Yeah, so a buddy of mine, actually the scoutmaster of my kids' troop, he has a Star Wars podcast, which you would think, that just, I think there's 2 or 3 of them talking about Star Wars, and you'd think, man, there's no way you could get, listeners, because that's got to be a saturated market. But they get down and dirty. Like, they go and they break down like scenes in like each individual scene in movies. They break down like the literature. They break down anything and everything in the books and the movies. Like, it's each individual episode is really, really specific. And they get, he said last year they had over 2 million downloads, which is huge.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Like, I think Disney is going to eventually buy their podcast.
Wouldn't surprise me.
And so you said that you thought it was a broad talk. I would say Star Wars is very niche. Like, a podcast on Star Wars. You would never hear a radio station on Star Wars or a radio show on AM/FM about Star Wars. It might get like that, Saturday afternoon, 30-minute slot.
Yeah.
But I would actually say probably not, because AM/FM is so geography heavy. So they want stuff that's relevant to like the local market. And so the point that I'm making here is the more niche you can get, like having a podcast about Michael Jordan, or a podcast about the Golden State Warriors, or a podcast about Star Wars, or even podcasts about working from home.
Nah, never work.
If you can get very granular, then that's when you know that you have an opportunity. Now, the second test, so that's the first kind of question that you want to answer in the test. The second question is, what's my competition? And so it's pretty simple. Adam, what do you use to listen to podcasts or to find podcasts?
I use a thing called Castbox.
Okay. So you use Castbox. I use Apple Podcasts, iTunes. So how do you find your competition? Easy. Go to Castbox or go to Apple Podcasts and type in your niche. So in the case of Michael Jordan, just go to your app and type in Michael Jordan and see if there is another podcast that is dedicated to Michael Jordan. When I got the idea for this show, I knew that I had an opportunity. It was great timing. And this is something, remember, podcasts are forever. Podcasts are like diamonds. When we're done with this show, 20 years from now, this podcast is still going to be on the internet. It's still going to be, in the digital sphere.
As long as we pay for it.
As long as we pay I think I have to pay like $5 a month to keep it up. And then our website's another, like $7 a month, maybe $10 a month.
Yeah, I have the hosting for other reasons. So really it's more like $10 a year.
Oh, okay. So as long as we pay those fees, the show is going to be up and running. And there's no telling that maybe, 5 years from now, there's another work from home revolution, and boom, our podcast from 5 years before is what shows up on search engine optimization when they go to Google or when they go to iTunes or Castbox or whatever, and front and center is the work from home show. And they say, oh, cool, there's a podcast on working from home. Let me take a listen. So what you want to do is you want to go to those apps like the Apple Podcasts or Castbox. You want to go to them and you want to see, okay, is there competition? Are there other shows that are doing the same thing? So for our show, I checked and I saw that there was one other podcast, and I mentioned this before. It's this guy who basically very clearly he pre-recorded like 100 episodes many years ago and is just publishing them. So there's no relevance to the modern day at all. And there's not any common, it's all business related. It's all how to do online marketing at home, how to make money from home, how to do SEO from home, how to do podcasting from home, how to write a book from home, how to create a website from home. There's not much of a personal touch to his podcast when it comes to like family and kids and eating right. And Adam, you and I know that there's so much more to working from home than just building a website.
There's the life part of it.
There's a life part of it. That's when I called Adam. I was like, look, man, we're a first mover in this space. We got to go for it. And so I knew, because it passed, I was able to answer both questions. It passed the test. That's how we launched this podcast. So that's how you guys, if you want a podcast, you want to answer those two questions. Question number one, am I podcasting in a niche, granular topic? Question number two, am I a first mover, or am I in a space that is not very crowded? And you can run that test by opening your Castbox or Apple iTunes app and checking for yourself.
Yeah, well, let's go over another reason why the whole niche thing is important, and that's because, if you have, let's say, we talked about how you're doing it for a business. If you have a business that's selling, let's just go back with sports. You're selling cricket gear, and you have a podcast that's just a sports podcast. You're going to be competing against all the sports podcasts, but you're also going to have listeners who, like baseball, like basketball, like this, that, and the other, and they don't matter to you. So what you want to do is you want to serve your customer best.
Yes.
So that's really why you want to get niches. You don't need 100,000 downloads per episode to have your business be successful. Because if those 100,000 people aren't your customer, then you may as well have zero. But if you have 100 people listening who are all really into cricket and are diehard fans, and they play every season, and they need gear all the time, and they learn about you and trust you and your company, and so they're buying everything from you, then your 100 listeners can make your business succeed. So, and that's really why you want to get so specific, is you would rather have a small number of people listening who are your audience 100% than a large group listening who maybe 1% is your audience. So that's my niche.
Yes, and
that's my niche pitch.
Yeah, no, and yeah, that's your niche pitch. And I should also say that even though you might think, oh, I only have 500 listeners to my podcast per episode, you might think that's really small because you're used to hearing these big numbers. Well, think of a podcast. A podcast is a very active form of communication. It's not passive. If you're watching the mainstream news, or the lamestream news, so if you're watching the lamestream news, it's very likely that you have it playing in the back. It's a passive form of content consummation. So you might go to a doctor's office and they have like Fox News or CNN or one of those lamestream networks playing, and so you're not actively paying attention to it. You're not actively like, oh, turn on CNN, I need to watch this special segment. No, it's a very passive form. Whereas with podcasting, a podcast listener is very similar to any other serial listener. Just like you have your favorite TV show that comes on every Tuesday or whatever day it is, and you're like, oh, I can't wait until the next episode comes out. A podcast is the same way. So you have a much more engaged, more qualified, because think about it, the people who are listening to the podcast, these are not folks who just turn on NBC on network TV. These are folks who own an Android or an iPhone, and they're technologically savvy, and they have to own an iPhone or an Android. You've got to pay what, $50-$60 a month so they can afford to pay the bill. This is a very qualified, sophisticated audience that you have. So having 500 listeners, it's actually really good. And it's like speaking at a conference to an engaged group of 500 people. That's really what it is. Whereas with CNN, and we used to run advertisements all the time when I was working full time at my previous employer. And we found that the lamestream news, the return on investment for advertising was horrible. Whether we went on as a guest on a TV show guest interview, or we advertised in between news segments, the return was awful. Whereas when we targeted those niche, like podcasts, niche blogs that had very, like much smaller audiences, but very much more qualified and engaged audiences, we saw a way astronomical higher return. Astronomical. And I'll just even give an example. Adam, you live in Austin. You know Alex Jones. And
yeah,
I'm sure many of our listeners know Alex Jones. We ran a campaign with Alex Jones back in 2012. And this campaign was, it was basically a conspiracy theory that President Obama was not just going to win the 2012 election, but he was going to run for a third term. And so we ran this advertising campaign on his show. And Alex Jones charged us, back then, it was $120,000 for this ad campaign. It was just a 3-day campaign. That's it. $120,000. And you got like banners on his website, ads on his live radio show, ads on his podcast versions, shout outs during the show, media interview, 2 segments of media interviews between our founder and Alex Jones. It was like this total media package. And you would think, like, who the heck would pay $120,000 for, a few ads? Well, guess what? We made over I want to say it was like $1.3 million back because of those ads.
That's not a bad return.
It's not a bad return, and it's because Alex Jones and his followers, they are way more qualified than somebody watching the mainstream news media.
Yeah.
And so those were the types of outlets. There's only one Alex Jones, but you get the idea that we targeted these niche media that had the loyal audiences. And that's what you can do as a podcaster. You can build that loyal audience. That's how strong a podcast can be.
Yeah, and also, I was looking it up. I remember that Libsyn had put out a thing that talked about how many listens if you get in the percentage. And believe it or not, it doesn't take much. If you have, I'm looking at their rankings here that they released on their podcast, and it says if you get 136 downloads per episode, you're in the top 50% of podcasts. If you get more than 1,100 downloads per episode, you're in the top 20%. And you get up to top 5% is 7,700 downloads per episode. If you can get up to 20,000, which is rarefied air, you're in the top 2%. 36,000 downloads, you're in the top 1%. So, a lot of people are making a lot of money on podcasts, and they're probably in the top 20% to make serious money. And that's only 1,100 downloads per episode, which it's a big number for a podcast, but it's not unattainable. But the only way you're going to get there is if you provide information to a specific audience and entering a niche market.
Yes, that's a really good data, Adam. Really good. Thanks for pulling that out of your hat, because that data is constantly changing. I know Podcastonomics was written 6 years ago, so it's good to know kind of what's a successful podcast. Really, I think if you're in the top 50%, you've made it past that hobby hurdle. Mm-hmm. Like those people in the bottom 50% are probably the hobby folks who are like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna do it.
Yeah.
So once you make it past that top 50%, congratulations. Like that's an accomplishment, and now you can work your way up.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what you should think about before you go ahead and start your podcast. You definitely should think about it. Something worth looking into. It can do a whole lot for your business. Just follow these simple rules and make sure it all gets done. Now, we are in no way, shape, or form done with podcasting. We have a whole lot more to come in our series on making money from home, some of which includes podcasting. Stick with us. We'll be back with way more on podcasting. Check us out at our website, workfromhomeshow.com. That's workfromhomeshow.com. As we mentioned before, send us a screenshot of your review to hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com. And we will send you a way to get hold of Naresh's best-selling book, Podcastnomics. And until next time, keep on working from home.